Hi.
How you doing? This is Barb Wallace. I'm here with Serena Burdick. Donna is not here today. She's up in Green Gables, moving her daughter into her first apartment. So she's sorry she missed it. She read the book too. We're going to be talking about The Stolen Book of Evelyn Aubrey. And the note I got was that she read it this weekend and she adored it. So basically we're going to kind of gush for 30 minutes. So this is a great book. As I said, this was one of my favorite books of the year. I'm going to read the back cover copy, but it doesn't really describe what the book's about. I mean, I think it does. There's Evelyn in 1898. She marries the famous novelist William Aubrey. But when William is gripped by writer's block, he blames Evelyn for his failures. He commits the ultimate betrayal, and she decides to write her way out of an unhappy marriage. In California in 2006, Abigail wondered about her absent father, his identity lost with her mother's untimely death. Or so Abigail thought, until she found his photo and a message that her great-great-grandmother was Evelyn Aubrey. In search of answers, she goes to England, where she learns of Evelyn's shocking disappearance and how London society believes she was murdered. Which is, on the surface, already sounds like an interesting book. But I thought this book was about much, much more. It was much deeper than the back copy gives it credit for. Because I was thinking about it. What would you say was the underlying theme of the book? Because I know what I think it was, but I would love to hear what you think it is.
Oh, that's a great question. The underlying theme of the book. I think that the underlying theme is family heritage, what we take with us through the generations, what follows us, even when you don't know who those generations are. So that was, like, for me, a really deep thread to writing the book, with Abigail not knowing who her great-great-great-grandmother was, but all these sort of similarities within their lives that had unfolded, and then the similarities within the lives of the women that had all come after them. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was a lot also about finding yourself, because, I mean, Abby clearly is going on a journey to find out who she is, because she's trying to find her father, and, you know, she didn't even know she had this side of the family. So she's searching. But Evelyn also kind of finds herself, because at the beginning of the book, she's very naive, and she discovers that there's a lot more inside her than she ever thought there was.
Yeah, I think self-discovery is a great
and women's voices, because I thought you did a really great job of explaining just how hard it was to have a voice at the turn of the century.
Yeah, I wanted to juxtapose the woman trying to make something in the world as anything. So a writer, like, of any significance, mirrored by the man who is the famous writer. Like, what does that look like when the man feels intimidated by the woman's confidence and skill, and like how the culture will or will not accept that.
Right. And you had Evelyn and her mother very much went along with the game and never said anything.
Yes.
And so that makes it even worse, because she had no support. And when you try to speak up back then, people thought you were kind of crazy and you were hysterical rather than assertive.
That's right. Yes, absolutely.
So, and then Abby's still, that's also with Abby. She's trying to find her voice, because if you don't know who you are, you really don't, you're not speaking true to yourself. She was saying a lot of things. She's kind of a hot mess at the beginning.
She absolutely, I heard there's a comment, someone's like, she seems a lot younger than 31 or whatever she is in the book. And I was like, yeah, I think that's kind of the point. Like, she is, like, never grown up. And at that stage of her life where she's gone through her 20s now, and she is still a total mess, this is a point, like a turning point, like something's got to break.
Right. And we've all met people like that. I mean, she's a barista in a coffee shop. She's not sure what she wants to do. She talks about being an artist, talks about a lot of things. And we've met people like that who just I know people like that who were at 30 who suddenly realized, like, well, hey, I should probably be an adult now.
That's right. And for her, it was figuring out, like, the past, just all not reconciling all of the things that she'd experienced and not been able to,
yeah.
The loose ends of having, her mother die and never taking to the grave with her who her father was.
Well, and her mother died when she was young enough that she never really knew her mother either.
Well, no, she's 13 when her mom died.
So that's true.
But good point. Yeah. She didn't become, like, an adult with her mother. She never got a chance to know her in that way.
Right. And we were off camera, we were talking about teenage years, and that's such an important time to get to know yourself, and she had no role model. I mean, she had a grandmother, but
Yeah.
you know, grandmothers are great, but they're so much older and from a different generation. And
Yeah.
they're just not going to get a 13-year-old in the 1980s, 90s.
And when a traumatic event happens too at that age, then it's like right before the rebellion kicks in, and then there's no way to like deal with it. It's just all repressed.
Right. And you know, the thing about generational tragedy or generational trauma, I do a lot of family genealogy, and you know, it's truth. So if something happened 200 years ago, it's kind of carried through for all those 100 years. It leaves its mark.
It is a theory. People write books on this, and yeah, the idea. You know, it's interesting because I wasn't thinking about it quite so specifically when I started out to write the book,
Yeah.
but I loved the idea that sort of these inadvertent traits would appear in both, you know, girls, because there's when she finds Lillian at the end. I also wanted those similarities, even though they're Abigail and Lillian are from such culturally different backgrounds in every way. I wanted like the similarities within the genetics to still come through in their personalities.
Oh yeah, and you know, it's also yeah, I was gonna say, like, they talk about people who my parents were raised in the Depression, so it came across very much as they got older. They were, you know, my grandparents and parents, and very money oriented. And I have a friend whose grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and everything they do is colored by that. So he's like, I'm 50 years old, but I could tell you, you know, how to protect myself from, because that's what the key was.
Right.
And so, yeah, it does carry through. Now,
Yeah.
which storyline came out first? Which one did you come up with?
Evelyn's. Yeah.
Evelyn.
So Evelyn's story, the thing about this book was so crazy is that I started it back in college, like 17 years ago.
Yeah, I read that.
Before I was like even thinking about being a writer, I wanted to do fiction. I'd always written, and I wrote Evelyn's story as a thesis paper for my graduation thesis paper. And then I was very clear. I was like, oh, I really want to turn this into a whole novel. And then, you know, the reality is Lillian, who shows up at the end, a third of the book was hers. She had an entire storyline. It was Abigail, Lillian, and Evelyn, and the three stories like wove together. And the book just, people loved it, and it just did not get no one wanted to buy it. They're like, oh, it's just not, there was just never quite anything right. So when it came down to it at this very last pitch, so many years later, my editor loved it, and they wanted to take out Lillian's story. And that was really hard for me. It's probably like one of the hardest things I've ever had to do as an author, because it was one of my favorite storylines. And I just loved her. And I felt like it was just real but that was like also a great learning lesson. Like it didn't work. It was too many stories. It was hard for the reader to get into it. Like I really had to just like let go and cut her whole story out. But she was actually the one that came before Abigail, her story.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, like Abigail's by far the weakest character in the beginning.
So what made you keep her and not Lillian? If you loved Lillian's storyline so much.
Oh, because that was what the editor, my agent and editor wanted. I couldn't not like Abigail's story had to be in there, and I did like it.
Yeah.
I mean, her story is like the connection. That was the thing. Like, I think Evelyn's story is sort of happening over here on its own. And I think that was the same thing. Abigail's story, or Lillian's story, was also happening on its own. And Abigail was the one that was like the connecting thread to the stories.
Yep.
But you have to have her. She's the one that, you know, she's the lookalike relative. She's the one that finds the father. She's doing all the steps to unearth like the story of what happened to her great-great-grandmother. So I can see why, meanwhile, just Lillian's story sort of unfolding in her life, which was a very simple and quiet story.
Right, but
wasn't the catchy one.
Yeah.
And so it made sense to just sort of knock her out and bring her in the end. But yeah, it was a very different book.
I can say as a reader, I thought it flowed really great without her. I can't pick it. And I really loved Abby's storyline because I was so happy to see her get straightened out and find all her answers.
Yeah, I would say this is my like happiest ending book I've ever written. I tend to have fairly not dark endings, but like they're very. This one was like, oh, this one I can kind of button it up nicely for my.
I did like this. I did like the happy ending. I was looking back, not that I stalked or anything, but you've written about a whole bunch of different time periods. And we just finished saying that we were talking about female empowerment. They all seem to have very similar themes, which is speaking up, women who are speaking up and being artists and speaking out for their right to have a voice.
Yeah.
So I guess you also like to make people disappear.
I do.
I noticed that.
Yep. Doing it in the book I'm writing right now. I do.
Good.
I definitely like when people disappear. I think it's a great storyline.
So what makes you gravitate? I mean, besides the fact that you're a woman and an artist, is there other reasons that make you gravitate towards the desire to talk about women in the past fighting for it? Or is it?
Well, I think that if you're going to write about any era that isn't within the last 20 years or 10 even, or even it's happening right now, I think when you're going to write about women, that if you're going to choose to have a strong character, then I feel like women just are endlessly fighting for their voices and have been in all the different generations. And I do think it's fascinating to write about I like writing about different eras to see what it looks like in different eras, because it looks very different, that, speaking up, trying to fight back, trying to find your own voice or your recognition. And I just think that's like the story of women for like ever.
Yeah.
So
still now. So yeah.
Yeah. So it's an easy theme to do when you're just trying to write any female character in the past that, has anything she's fighting for.
That is a very good point, because I've read books where the woman seemed too modern because people didn't argue with her. And I think that was very rare. I think your books are much more realistic in that men frequently shut them down. Not because they were horrible people, just the way things were.
Yeah.
Although, like I said, in Evelyn's, her husband is a horrible person. And
yeah, he's a bad character.
Well, and there is an event in the middle of the book, and I don't like to spoil it, but I think he was involved in that too. Were you trying to imply that with the father, or?
Oh yeah, that's funny. I know what you're talking about, and I feel like I knew when I wrote it that it could be interpreted that way. So no, I never intended for him to actually be involved in that. But I did realize like it kind of leaves this open, like, oh, could he possibly have been? But in my
her a lot, even more, like you were already rooting for her and you're like, oh yeah, totally screw him now.
Yeah, I did want to make it be really okay that he's just not. I gave him very few redeeming qualities. I also wanted
he deserved everything he got.
I wanted to stress like his mental illness too, just the idea that back then, he was most likely manic depressive, and like there was no diagnosis for that, or not that it excuses any of his behavior, but it just helps to make his erratic behavior believable in a way that.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, he didn't come across as a cookie cutter villain. He came across as someone who was unstable.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted.
He thinks he was a bad person. He believed so much what he was doing, and I think that, which I think makes the best villains, when they actually believe, that they're doing something right, as opposed to just being mean for no reason. He was unstable.
Yeah. I think that. And I do, you're right. Like, I think the most believable characters are the ones that absolutely believe everything that they are doing is the right thing. And it's so much so where men, I do find when you read, if you read male authors of the past or perspectives of men in that way, like they were raised in a culture that, raised them to believe this, and they just unequivocally believe it. It's not even there's no thought in their mind that a woman wouldn't stay in her place, or like it's surprising to them. It's not even cruel necessarily. It's just like, well, this is just how it's done. What are you talking about?
Well, I joke, because my husband and I have this joke, but like if a woman fell down, tripped over a step, she would say, I tripped. The man's first thing would be to look at the step and say, oh, that step's uneven or something. And I think that you're right. I think it's just because that's how they're taught. So yeah, and I think he was a really great villain in that he wasn't bad at the beginning. So you could see where she could fall for him.
Right.
And
No, he fell into his own sort of hole of darkness, and
right.
as time went on.
And it's a really toxic relationship, but it's very compelling because she's just as dark as he is, and she gives just as good as he does after a while. She kind of learns how to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And hardens herself, but in a way that you root for her to be, because she's not a victim.
Yeah. You
I
want her
love
to yeah. You want her to get back it.
That's it. So I'm guessing it's just that you really loved this story, and that's why it never went under your bed. Because a lot of writers after 17 years would have said, I think, you know what, I've sold 3 others. I'm just going to keep moving on to another book, and I'll just put this under there and call it my growth book and leave it at that.
You know, I kind of had gotten to that stage with it. I did love it, and I remember, you know, it first didn't sell. I wrote the other one that sold, and I was like, oh, okay, what about this one? It just kept coming up for a while, and then by the time, I think there was a point, it was more my agent, like,
Yeah.
well, let's pitch this. Why don't you write something else? Like, let's wait. And then I just was like, oh, it's done. I was like, I'd given up even asking, because I was kind of like, oh, well, can we pitch that book now? And then all of a sudden what happened was I was writing a different story, and I had written the first 50 pages. We had a proposal, and she pitched that story, and my editor wasn't interested. And I was like, wait, why? I love that story. She's like, no, it's not. I don't know the time period. It doesn't sound. And so my agent, like, in the moment, was like, okay, I have this other book.
Good for the agent. Go her.
And she was like, my editor was like, oh, that sounds great. Yes. So I got the phone call that said, so I'm really sorry, but I couldn't sell this other idea. But guess what? I sold your first book. And I was like, what? And then I had to totally rewrite it, which, oh my God, I never want to have to do that again. I had already rewritten it so many times, I can't even tell you.
Oh, yeah.
And then it was hard to go back to. Like, I think I'm a very different writer than I was when I first wrote it. So it's like, you know, you just unearth like old writing you're not happy with, writing that isn't really your voice anymore, coupled with like all these major changes. And so it was a huge, huge overhaul. And it's, I think, a lot harder to take a book and fully take it apart and put it back together than to just start over. So it was a challenge. But I'm really, really happy with the way it turned out. I added things, and I think having experienced I'm a far more experienced writer now than I was obviously when I first wrote it.
Yeah.
Even the times that I rewrote it. You know, I'm working on my 5th book at this point. So for me, just the level of growth through all of those writing experiences allowed me to come back to this book and just add things that I just feel like have made the book so much stronger. So it felt very rewarding, even though it's a lot of hard work.
No, I understand. I actually had a book once where the editor sent it back and said, I love the premise, but could we change the conflict? And the last chapters 2 to 10 or something like that. And I was like, so the book.
Exactly.
She's like, oh, yeah, that's it. Yeah. So I know the feeling. How many years does it take you to write a book?
So I try to write a book in 1 year, but just the first very rough draft.
Yep.
And then I spend about a year editing it. So I always say like about 2 years.
Oh, okay. And do you have a favorite time period?
No, I do not. I do clearly, I think I'm an unusual historical fiction author maybe, in that I jump all over the place. People kind of make note of that. I think there are a fair amount of writers kind of stick with one genre.
Yeah.
I'm just interested in too many things. Although I will say this last round, I thought, I'm now writing a book that takes place between like the 30s to the 50s, and part of it's during World War II. And again, totally, I was like, oh, I see that writers stick to the same eras, because I have to research all over again every single time period, like starting from scratch. And the research process is a lot of work. So I was like, oh, it'd be nice to stick to something so that I can just not have to, so I know a little bit about what's going on in this era. And, but I do really like to just jump around.
I was gonna say, that kind of dovetails into, every month we do a segment where we talk about writing tips. And this month is actually about pre-planning and research, which coincidentally we're both going to be doing next month. So no ulterior motive there. But so when you approach a new book, what is your process? Do you go to the research first and say, okay, I want to write in this time period, or do you go to a subject?
So I generally have a story usually percolates, like definitely, and every time I'm in the middle of a book, which is what I'm in the middle of right now, there's another story idea sort of brewing elsewhere. So I gather my story idea and then I just sort of keep it in my mind for a long time, working the story. And then, but before I sit down to write anything, I absolutely dive into like months of research first. I'd say maybe my time is short. It used to be like 4 to 6 months. I would just research.
Yeah.
Now it's like I try to do it in a couple months. And so because I get really, once I start writing, I just get so into the writing. It's really hard for me to jump out and be like, and it's also hard for me to run up against things constantly that I can't move forward because I don't know what happened or what they'd use, or like, I just want to be so in the time period that I can just flow with my writing.
Okay.
So I will immerse myself in the time period by reading fiction written in the time period. I think that's the best way to.
That's a really good point.
Gather. Well, that's where you get the details. So even
Yeah.
if it's fiction, like the person writing in that time period has all the details of what you need. And so I read fiction and make very like notes throughout the entire book. And I have categories of food, clothing, transportation, lighting, housing, architecture. And so I take notes while I'm reading it. And I have a notebook I fill with all of those details. And then I always have a nonfiction book I'm also reading about just like politics or history or whatever was going on within the era that I'm writing. So I dive in that way so that when I'm done, I have this notebook full of notes and I sort of have steeped myself in the era. So it feels a little bit natural to like sit down to my work. And then inevitably while I'm writing, I run into a million things that I don't know. I'm always referring back to my notebook or jumping online to be like, oh my God, wait, I don't even, and then
you go down the rabbit hole and
and it's distracting and you've lost 3 hours of writing.
Okay. Well, all right. A couple more quick questions because I told you I'd get you out of here in a half hour because you have a busy day. Tell us a little bit about the book you're working on now.
So the book starts out in 1952 in Lexington, Massachusetts. It's a married couple with 2 daughters. And the woman is from England and the husband, they met in France during World War II. So there's like a very dark past with them about how their relationship started. And I wanted to sort of juxtapose the war violence with like the sort of conservative buttoned upness of the 50s in the US. I was like, oh, it occurred to me that all those people like went through. So the woman, the main protagonist is from England, but she lived in Paris and she was involved in Peggy Guggenheim's sort of modern art world that was exploding. So she lived super avant-garde. There were like sexuality was completely open. You know, the way that they lived in Paris in the 30s could not have been any more different than like 50s New England. So it opens up with Man Ray I don't know if you know the artist Man Ray. He has a photograph. So she knew him and a photograph appears in Lexington that is a Man Ray, but she knows it wasn't taken by Man Ray. It was taken by her friend and buried on a camera in France during the war. So she steals this painting in the very beginning of the book and disappears. And so then we flash back to what her life in the 30s with this relationship in the art world to meeting her husband, to this photograph, and like what happened to her best friend who took the photograph, which is also like a devastating and guilty story for them. And then flashes back to present day, the husband's perspective of him now taking his girls and trying to find his wife and where she's gone with this photograph.
Oh, very cool. So it sounds like it's all those familiar themes then too about learning who the family is. Oh, I'm excited. Does it have a release date or are you still kind of?
I haven't even sold it yet. No, my agent, it's funny. This time, no, I know. It's interesting. Usually, often I can like pitch a book and sell it on a proposal. But my agent was like, she was waiting for this one to come out and she's got a plan. She does all of her ways strategically and she's super smart. So she's like, let's wait for this book to get out into the world. Let's get some numbers. And then she wanted like a completed manuscript. Just for a stronger, I think it's a stronger maybe sell or Yeah, she just was like, let's get like a solid, finished, polished manuscript. So I am hoping to finish it. My goal is to get it to her by March, so I've got only about like 6 weeks left to finish it.
So hopefully we'll see something from you in 2024.
Yeah, that would be ideal. Yes, I'm hoping to sell it this spring. Get a book deal
go.
this spring to have it be done. So right, it's 2023. So then yes, about a year. It's about, once you sell a book, I've noticed about a year and a half to pub date.
Okay.
So yeah, if I sold it this spring, it'd be like it'd be like, yeah, in an ideal world, like, yeah, fall of 24.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, in the meantime, then, say someone who, you know, had a video show and was going to the bookstore that afternoon to buy another Serena Burdick book. Which one would you recommend?
Oh, I
can't decide between two.
Okay, well, this is hard for me because The Girls with No Names is by far my best-selling, most popular book. People absolutely love it. I personally really love Find Me in Havana. It's weirdly one of my favorite books, but it's like my least. It doesn't sell nearly as well as my others.
And that's a true story, right?
It's a true story. Maybe that's why I love it, because I have like a personal connection to it. But I also feel that my writing in that book is kind of some of my best writing. I don't know why I feel that way, but I do. I think the story, I'd say that the story in The Girls with No Names is more gripping, and
I think it's more what I was leaning towards, because that sounds
really and it's more complex, and people really do love it. I would recommend that one. I think you can't go wrong with that book. The other thing with Find Me in Havana is there's a lot of violence, and I think that's hard for some people.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And, I mean, the ideal answer is buy both. First, buy this one.
That one, yes. And then I would say The Girls with No Names. People people just love that book.
It sounds really good. For those who are listening, it's about a woman's looking for her sister, and she gets herself committed. And it reminds me a lot of, there was a nonfiction book that we read a couple years ago by Kate Moore, and it was based on a true story of a woman who was committed because she was too outspoken.
Yeah. Where did that book take place?
Somewhere in the South, I think.
Okay.
And her husband she was there for 10 years, and they just, you know, she fought and fought and fought to get out. And her problem was she was smarter than her husband and more eloquent, and she was smarter than most men. And I think that they were so intimidated that they just wouldn't let her go. She would make these arguments, and they just used it as proof that she was hysterical.
Yeah.
And I wish I could remember the name of it now, but I think it was by a woman named Kate Moore, who did the nonfiction. And it was, it's really very well done. It's this narrative nonfiction, and the woman's life afterwards, like the struggle she went through to get her children back, everything. And, you know, you're so frustrated with society by the end. And that's what Girls of No Name kind of reminded me about.
Yeah.
Like, the fact that you're penalized for being smart.
Or just for being a girl for no other reason.
You know, you can't rest your brain. You can't handle math. You know,
that's right.
So, all right. My last question. What's on top of your to-be-read pile?
Oh, The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. I love Maggie O'Farrell. She put that book out, I think, this fall, and I have not gotten to it. I did just also read, I have to say, and it was astounding, The Rabbit Hutch, which won the National Book. It's great. I mean, it is just really phenomenal writing. I was very impressed. So that was my favorite last read, and I'm looking forward to The Marriage Portrait.
That's on we have to do a reading challenge, and that's actually one of the books we put on the reading challenge.
Oh, great.
Everyone tells me that if I don't read Maggie O'Farrell, I'm missing out.
Yeah, I recommend Hamnet, which is also astoundingly good. I mean, she's just great. She's fantastic.
Okay. Well, I'll give you one back then. Is our favorite up here is Vanessa Riley.
I don't.
She wrote Island Queen.
Okay.
Justin, and it's about a woman in 18th century Caribbean island. It's a true story. She became the wealthiest woman there.
Oh, that sounds great.
She's a former slave. Like, she ended up buying her entire family's freedom, rose to become one of the richest women in the islands. It's a really fascinating story. And Vanessa she's a fantastic writer.
Oh, great. I'll check that out. Yeah.
Yeah. So I sell Vanessa to everybody.
That's fantastic. Great. Yay.
So thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Taking time out, parking in the car in the woods and talking.
Yeah.
We really appreciate it. If people want to know more about your books, it's serenaburdick.com, right?
Yep.
We'll put the link, and we'll put the buy links to all your books in that we've talked about. Again, it's the Stolen Book of Evelyn Aubrey, and I said it was one of my favorite books of the year. Donna agrees with me. So everyone go out and buy it. And we appreciate it. We can't wait till we get a new one out for you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me, Barb.
Thank you. All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take care.